Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel, or welcome if you're new. Today I'm bringing you a different type of video, one where I have been filming over the last 6 months and compiling some clips into a video for you to watch, because I have now read all of those books and I want to give some context to what you're going to see. So I did some research in summer of last year where I was kind of wanting to understand where my love for horror came from and what it was in these stories that are so foundational, and also pull some kind of correlation as to why my current favourite horror books are my favourite horror books, and if they relate to older classics and how they all interconnect. What were the standout books that really do form this genre? And then I stumbled into the Unholy Trinity of books. This is like a play on the Holy Trinity from the Catholic Church, and it's kind of like outlining those three books that are so foundational within our favourite genre and why we see what we see today. They tend to be based on these three books, especially within like possession and religious horror. These are like foundational texts, so to speak. And that makes up the Unholy Trinity, which is what you're here to watch today. I didn't read these books in order of publication. I read them as and when I felt like reading them. So in publication order, the first book that makes up this Unholy Trinity is Rosemary's Baby by Ira Levin. So this is a story that is centered around this couple who are kind of down on their luck. They don't have a really good time, and so they just struggle on together. And they move into this apartment in New York City, and they make friends with this elderly couple who live across the hall from them. And then all of a sudden, their life starts to improve, and then her husband gets a good job on a show. She becomes pregnant, and it's kind of like a fever dream from there. So this was first published in 1967, which forms the start of the Unholy Trinity. Then next up we had The Exorcist by William Peter Blatty. So this story, everybody knows, it's so iconic. It is the focal point of possession stories. So we follow a girl, Regan, who is possessed by a demon, and it follows her family's struggle with dealing with this demon and trying to get the demon out of Regan. So it's really interesting. This is very religious, obviously centered around possession, and this was published in 1971. And then finally, the last book to be published in this era is The Omen by David Sessler. So The Omen is again centered around the Antichrist, the coming of the end of time when the Antichrist, this demon child, comes to earth again. This story again follows a couple who are trying to have children and it's not successful, but then the doctor comes to them and says, this child's just lost its mother, kind of similar to your wife. She won't know the difference. Here, raise this child. When this child turns 5, weird stuff happens, and this was published in 1976. So these are the Unholy Trinity of books that center around religious horror, possession, and demon children. So in this video, you're going to see me read these books across multiple months. I will give you my thoughts on each of them, and at the end, I will tell you which book stands out the most to me and which one I like the least. So, enjoy the video. So I've now finished The Exorcist. I have a lot of thoughts on this, Originally, I thought it was a 5-star read, and that's what I've put into my Goodreads following initially finishing it. But on reflection, I think that it's probably a 4, not so much a 5. And I think that's mainly due to pacing. The first half of this book was so good. It built the dread, and you could tell that something was happening, and the fact that Regan is a young child and she's saying and doing these things makes it very disturbing. But the pacing is just a bit off. The chapters are very long. I'm not really sure how the title kind of represents the overall story and the overall plot of this book. I know that he took a case that was real life and kind of adapted it to create this story. So he has fictionalized a real story to create The Exorcist. But for me, I feel like this story isn't so much about the exorcist himself. It's more about Regan and how this possession affects the family. So I'm not really entirely sure that the title really fits the story. I really loved how this story highlighted the effects that this possession had on the people within close vicinity to Regan, and it follows that aspect. And how much detail this gives you in terms of exorcisms and the theological element, how atheists can start to kind of believe in this element of the supernatural. There is positive themes within this story, don't get me wrong, I really loved it. It's just the pacing throughout that maybe drops it down slightly for me. Like I mentioned, the first half was incredible. It was building dread and I was anticipating what was coming next. And then when we got into the abyss, it was really long. And for me, I really enjoyed chapters that are shorter and they're easier to get through. So I think that area of the book could have been 3 or 4 extra chapters. It didn't all have to be in one. But then I think that's just an edit type of deal. It's not the overall story. It's just how I can interpret the book. So those are my nitty picks of the story. Like I mentioned, the good parts about this was the theology within morals and ethics as well. So it does highlight a lot of things and covers a lot of different themes, which I'm quite surprised by for a book written back in the day, in the 70s. But it was really, really interesting. And I love how this author used the fact that she was a child to make this more disturbing. But if this was a teen or an adult, I don't think the things that she was doing and saying would have been that surprising. So the fact that it was a little girl made this very dark and disturbing in that sense. There are parts of my book that were missed within the audiobook, and I think that was done on purpose, but I'm not entirely sure. There were parts of this story that I was reading that I wasn't hearing in my audiobook, which are certain words and phrases that were a bit explicit. Don't get me wrong, this book does not dial out all of the explicit elements. It graphically details things that she does to her body, but there are parts where it gets cut out, so I don't know if that was a choice in the author reading a different version of this story. But yeah, I felt like there was more graphic detail in my copy versus the audiobook. But I definitely do enjoy the fact that there's an audiobook for this. I feel like when I was reading it without the audiobook, there was elements that were a little bit slower for me, whereas while I was listening, I could follow along easier. So it definitely helped for me to understand the story and how the author was meaning it to come across, because he adds words here and there rather than in this book, for example, it was always she said. A lot of he said this, they did that. Whereas in the audiobook, he would replace she with the name. So Chris said this, Chris did that, Paris thought this. So we kind of get more of a detailed description in terms of who was thinking what. So it definitely helped to really build that picture in your head. But I enjoyed it. I feel like my initial reaction was like, whoa. So I am a fan of this and the overall story. I just feel like it could have been paced a lot better. I love the themes and concepts that were discussed in this book. So yes, I did enjoy The Exorcist. My original thought was a 5-star read, but on reflection the next day I am giving it a 4-star, simply because of the reasons that I have stated. But I am looking forward to rereading this at some point, because I do feel like this is a foundational piece within horror. And as somebody who's read a lot of horror, I am quite surprised that it's taken me this long to pick up The Exorcist. Mainly because I thought it was super scary, following people's opinions and reviews of this book. But I don't think it is as scary as people think. For me, it's more dark and disturbing, not scary. This one I put off for a while. I'm not sure why, but I picked it up once I decided to start this new reading challenge for myself. I give this a 5-star. This book was incredible. I enjoyed this so much more than I was expecting to. This is kind of a terrifying story in terms of its treatment of human beings, and especially women, and the language used to depict and describe and highlights how people don't really treat them all that well. So it was horrifying and disturbing in that sense, and it was incredible to read. It was a fast read for me. I read this in a day, in one sitting. So really loved reading this. And there's a quote from this book that really stood out. I wrote it down. So it's, "When you're older, you'll come to realize that acts of kindness are few and far between in this world of ours." So yeah, it's kind of depicting what I mentioned about how people in this world aren't treated all that well. And that quote kind of symbolizes that, and it highlights that problem in the book so well. So in terms of Rosemary as a character, I find that she was really likable. The overall journey that she has, you were rooting for her. She was so intelligent and not a dumb character or main protagonist that you often see in these types of stories. So that was really good, and something that I actually enjoyed reading in this. You were really rooting for her, and her likability was really high, and it kind of screamed like a fever dream story, like plot line, and you were kind of questioning certain things as well throughout this book. And yeah, it was so intriguing. The writing was perfect. I feel like this writing style has held up in the modern day. This was written in the 60s, and it reads as if it was written yesterday. So I really love that aspect, that it's readable even in today's standards. Granted, there is some word choices and societal norms in this that probably wouldn't be around today, but overall the readability was so high and enjoyable. Like, overall it is an enjoyable book, and it felt like a modern story. The overall plot had really good pacing throughout this book. You never felt like it was slow or rushed in parts. Normally I find that pacing is a bit off in a lot of books that I read. You're getting a really slow build up, and then all of the action is in the last little bit of the book. Whereas this was beautifully paced, and yeah, I mean, I can't fault this book. It was such a fun read, and it is such a short book, so creating that unease in such a limited space was incredible. Definitely a work of art right here. It's amazing. Really terrifying book. Loved it. Such a great read, and probably one of my favorite reads that for this horror catch up. Of course, because I've only read two. So yeah, this is probably better than The Exorcist in my opinion, simply because of its readability and how it can be read as if it was written today. And the overall storyline was incredible. I do love The Exorcist, don't get me wrong. It's a great story, but currently I am favoriting Rosemary's Baby, which is a surprise for me because I didn't think that I would enjoy this book. I thought this would be like a 3-star average read, probably not the best for this catch-up book club thing, but honestly it was incredible, and I would highly recommend picking up Rosemary's Baby if you haven't read it yet. Gone 9 chapters into this book, and whilst I'm really close to the end, I still wanted to jump in here and give you some of my initial thoughts on the story. So the book overall is very religious. It's kind of similar to The Exorcist as well in terms of its descriptions on the supernatural and how it relates to religion. So it's interesting in that sense. And also, I think that this is very detailed. It definitely doesn't hold back on its treatment of children and what actually happens in this book. It's very gross and dark. So there's a lot happening, and I'm kind of shocked by it because it is from the 70s, and I feel like horror was just beginning and taking a stance as its own genre. And The Exorcist was something that kind of edged on the side of darker material, because of the things that she was saying and doing in that book. But The Omen, I think, just went off the edge in terms of how it describes children, violence against children, and how they view this child as the Antichrist and all of this stuff. It's very twisted, so I am enjoying the book. And I do have like 3 more chapters left until the end, and I'm intrigued to see how this ends and where it goes, because at this point it's very detailed, graphic, and horrific. I'll check back in a bit. So I just finished The Omen a couple days ago and getting around to filming my thoughts now. So initially I was really excited for this book simply because of how similar it had been to The Exorcist and Rosemary's Baby. To me, this kind of felt like a follow-on from Rosemary's Baby. I'm not sure why. I think it's because Rosemary's Baby stops when the child is born, and then this is kind of picked up in the aftermath, like 5 years later, when the kid is 5 and the weird shit starts to happen. And I really liked that element because it kind of develops the story really well. I really love how this was written. I was able to follow this story along. The plot was decent, and yeah, I think overall the concept I can get behind and I enjoyed reading. But for me, I think how heavily influenced by religion this is kind of made my enjoyment a lot less than the other books, because I think the Omen has a lot more religious content than the other books I've read in this series. So I don't really relate to the religious side of this, but I can see as a horror story why this is so enjoyed and how it's become like a foundation within this genre. I will say that this is very dark. There's a lot of descriptions of child death and child murder. There's mentions of abortion in here. So it covers a lot of dark topic matters, which I'm quite surprised by a book written in the 70s to have that much detail and that much description of these terrible acts. Some of it did kind of get me. I had to take a step back and yeah, I mean, I could just picture it and it was kind of disturbing. But that is the point, so I guess it's done its job. But other than that, I think that it was a decent read. I don't think it's like my favorite out of the ones that I've read for this series, and it's not one I think I will return to. But that's not to say I didn't enjoy it. I have enjoyed the concept of this book and the plot. I just didn't really connect with the religious side of this, and I think that's where it drops for me, really. I did listen along with the audiobook, and the audiobook uses a different name than that's written in the book. So Robert is our main character, but the audiobook kept saying Jeremy, and it was kind of off-putting a lot of the time. I didn't see the need for the change. So with that, I don't really know what else to say other than it was an okay read. I'm giving it 3 stars. So this book is probably sat at the bottom of this Unholy Trinity of books. So just jumping back in here now to round out this video. Thank you for coming to the end and finding out which book is my favourite. So out of this, you would have seen that I read The Exorcist first, then Rosemary's Baby, and then The Omen. So I enjoyed Rosemary's Baby the most in this Unholy Trinity of books. I feel like this has writing that does stand out today. I love the different themes that we discuss in this book. It's more satanic than Catholic or Protestant religious horror, which I think I enjoy more anyway than those other types of stories. So yeah, this one was my favorite read. I enjoyed reading this one. The experience I had reading it was so much fun. I enjoyed the descriptions and the visceral nature of Regan and what she was saying and what she was doing in this. It was an interesting read. This is very much a Christianity religious horror book, but that's not to say that it's not enjoyable. I did enjoy this. And then finally, The Omen comes in last for me. I enjoyed this one the least. Still a 3-star though. It's decent. I enjoyed the plot and the overall concept of this story. The themes mentioned also were interesting. I just feel this one is very heavy on religion and all of that theming. So this one I enjoyed the least out of the 3. But that is the Unholy Trinity of horror books. They make up the religious possession, demonic children genre. And I have noticed that a lot of books kind of take inspiration from these. And of course, they are foundational texts in the genre, so they are necessary reads. and now I can say that I have read them and enjoyed at least all of them a little bit, some more than others. But anyway, thank you so much for watching this. Let me know in the comments which of these unholy books do you enjoy the most. I would love to have that conversation with you. And if you haven't read any of them, which one are you more likely to pick up? But with that, keep your pages turning and embrace the darkness. Bye!